Recovered file 2047. The transfer arrived in Vault 13 under a municipal evidence seal that had been broken and resealed twice, with different closure dates pressed into the same flap. The anomaly was already inside the file. It recorded one unidentified man at the same minute in hundreds of places across a mid-sized city, and the first inventory check showed that the copies did not agree with one another. Several evidence sleeves were water-damaged, though the pages inside remained legible. That damage was part of the problem. One label called the material a traffic audit. Another called it a cyber review. A third, handwritten and later crossed out, called it a false positive swarm. The package also contained duplicate exports that were listed as identical and were not. Their headers matched. Their contents did not. This case was cross-referenced against earlier vault holdings on distributed visual anomalies and unstable municipal timestamps. Those older files failed in familiar ways. This one did not fail. It was the record itself that preserved the failure. The transfer centered on a routine collision review. A van had struck a utility pole near dusk, and traffic control pulled nearby camera lanes to reconstruct the impact. In that review, an analyst named Rios noted a man in a dark coat standing near an intersection 3 blocks from the collision site. The same man then appeared in 18 separate feeds at the same recorded minute. The first reports remained cautious. They raised the ordinary possibilities: misaligned clocks, mirrored input, an inserted export. Those ideas lasted only until frame comparison began. One contractor isolated 6 cameras with different angles and different resolutions. The man occupied the correct positions in each. His shadow fell the right way. A bus passed behind him on one feed and briefly obscured his outline. In another feed from the same minute, he turned his head before the bus reached the frame. A short contractor note captured the turn. It read, "Export verified against source disk and live recorder cache. Subject appears in all listed assets. No image duplication detected." That was the first hard confirmation. The files were not repeating a single image. They were preserving separate recordings of the same man in separate places. The file became more troubling when the review team found a body camera transcript listed in the chain of custody but absent from the package. In its place was audio from a camera system declared offline for maintenance that evening. The clip was brief. The man was present. So was a phrase that did not fit the rest of the packet. He said, "Not yet." That sentence appeared again later in other records, but here it mattered for a different reason. The city had not yet understood that the recordings were multiplying faster than the explanations. The first stage ended with the fact the investigators could not dismiss. The cameras had not agreed on where he was. They had agreed on when. Recovered file 2047. Continuation from sealed municipal transfer. The first review established that the man was real within the recordings. The next documents removed the last comfort of a single bad minute. the timestamp held under independent verification down to frame alignment, encoder logs, and local clock drift. The city had enough separate systems to explain a lie. It did not have enough to explain this. The clearest confirmation came from Rios. Her supplementary note is short. Export verified against source disk and live recorder cache. Subject appears in all listed assets. No image duplication detected. She had expected a bad time source, a damaged export, or one reused clip inserted across cameras. Instead, each file preserved its own version of the same man with the correct perspective for its location. One parking deck camera showed him crossing beneath a broken fluorescent light. The reflected light on the wet concrete matched the weather report from that block. A pharmacy feed showed him in profile while a delivery truck passed behind him, its brake lights washing the glass doors red for a moment. A transit platform camera caught the hem of his coat moving in the draft from an arriving train. Those details mattered because they were not shared artifacts. They were separate observations of the same minute. The team understood that before they understood the scale. Their first map covered only 23 cameras near the collision corridor. It did not stay small. When they widened the search, they found him on feeds with no relation to the original incident. A grocery loading bay, a clinic exterior, a bus stop 2 districts away, a residential lobby where the angle suggested he had never looked at the camera, yet the camera still caught him passing through. He was not always centered, he was not always moving the same way, but he was always present. The emergency coordination log shows the moment the matter stopped being a local audit. A supervisor asked for a full network sweep and a separate hash check of every export. A systems technician replied that the files had already passed integrity validation twice. The supervisor asked whether the source record could have been compromised before archiving. The answer was no. Live recorders and saved exports matched. That removed the last barrier between ordinary failure and the thing in the footage. A brief exchange from the review room marks the shift. One contractor said, if he is in all of them, he has to be in none of them. Another answered, he is in the one we are not seeing. The line was logged as an argument over terminology. It was actually the first recognition that the appearances were not copies. They were placements. The first contradiction arrived when analysts overlaid routes. The instances did not fan out from a single origin. Some moved toward one another from opposite sides of the city. Others appeared to take streets that should have brought them into the same intersection within seconds of each other. In a normal review, that would have suggested a tracking error. Here, it suggested multiple paths the city could not reconcile. 2 instances could be traced to within a block of each other and still never meet in any shared feed. At that stage, the review team stopped using suspect. That was not courtesy. It was a data decision. No footage showed him attacking, fleeing, or addressing anyone. He moved like a pedestrian with a fixed errand, though the errand changed from feed to feed. On one camera, he let a cyclist pass. On another, he turned his head as if listening to traffic from a side street, out of frame. In a third, he looked up at a building facade with enough attention to suggest recognition. The same minute held all of it. The first measurable limit appeared when review software began flagging the number of confirmed appearances against available time. The audit window was 12 minutes long. By the end of the second pass, the team had logged 56 appearances across 29 systems. Later summaries disagree on the totals. One memo says 74. Another says more than 100. The routing log simply marks the period as unresolved simultaneous presence and stops counting. The appearances also began to diverge. His posture loosened in some feeds and stiffened in others. In one downtown camera, he hesitated at a crosswalk, looking left and right with the caution of a pedestrian waiting for a signal. In a feeder road feed, the same coat moved with the shorter stride of someone hurrying between parked cars. A lobby camera caught him with one hand in his pocket and the other brushing a door frame as he passed. Those differences were small, but they broke the simplest theory. The recordings were no longer matching because they were never identical. A few audio channels deepened the problem. One feed carried a murmur that sounded like, "Not here." Another preserved, "Too late." A third, from a transit stairwell, caught what the contractor transcribed as, "I saw you." The wording was uncertain, but the variation mattered. The phrases did not repeat cleanly. They changed by source. That made them harder to dismiss. One contractor report reduced the whole matter to a single line. Instances appear to respond to local conditions. That sentence shifted the case from a visual anomaly to a behavioral one. The man was not merely recorded in many places. He was recorded as if each camera had captured a different version of the same movement, adjusted to the street, the light, the obstruction, and the timing. On one roofline camera, he tilted his head when a siren sounded off frame. On a subway concourse feed, he slowed near a reflective panel as if checking his own reflection, though not long enough for certainty. By the end of the first day, the city had done what cities do when a record refuses to simplify. It expanded the review. Traffic control pulled transit. Transit pulled retail security. Police pulled body cameras and station corridor feeds. Contracted analysts pulled archived clips that had not been part of the original collision reconstruction. Every new search found him somewhere else, always within the same recorded minute, always in a place that seemed unrelated to the last. That wider search produced the first unsettling spatial contradiction. A camera on the 5th floor of a municipal parking structure showed the man standing at a railing, looking down at the street. Minutes later, a street camera directly below that structure showed a separate instance crossing the entrance lane in the same coat, head lowered against wind. The two feeds had compatible sight lines, but they did not cross. The city checked weather, vehicle motion, and pedestrian counts. Everything held. He was above and below himself in the same minute, with no overlap except the records. The municipal response hardened after that. A police memo instructed staff not to discuss the matter outside the coordination room. The phrasing was careful, but the next line was plain enough. Media attention would be difficult to explain. The city had not yet decided whether the footage represented a threat, a compromise, or a failure of public confidence. It could not permit the possibility that all three were true in different parts of the network. The file turns there. The review team kept finding more instances. But the more important discovery was that the city no longer knew what would count as the same man. Facial matches remained above threshold in every case. Analysts noted slight differences in gait, shoulder angle, and the way he held his hands. One reviewer wrote that he looked tired in one district and alert in another. Another said the face was consistent, but the intention was not. Those are not standard categories in video forensics. They became necessary here because the evidence would not stay inside standard categories. The last document in this phase should have been routine. Instead, it shows the man entering camera coverage in a shopping corridor, a courthouse annex, a parking garage, and a riverside pedestrian path, all within the same recorded minute. The four locations are too far apart for one body to cross. A handwritten correction in the margins says, "Not moved, recorded." That did not resolve the contradiction. It made it worse. By the end of the first review cycle, the city had enough authenticated footage to prove the event and not enough physical possibility to explain it. The cameras did not fail, the records did not conflict. The man only became more certain as the city tried to account for him. The city widened the search after the first review cycle, and that decision changed the file. The anomaly stopped looking concentrated and started looking distributed. By the third round of export review, the man had been identified on dozens of additional cameras, then on scores, then on enough feeds that the analyst summaries began listing neighborhoods rather than camera numbers. The problem was no longer one corridor. It had become a city-wide accounting issue. The strongest early expansion came from transit analyst Velez. She compared the original collision packet against archived feeds from the same hour and wrote, "I found him in places we did not query." She meant systems left out of the first request because they seemed irrelevant. Subway platforms, parking decks, apartment lobbies, a grocery loading bay, a hospital exterior camera, a municipal archive feed indexed as inactive. The man appeared in all of them within the same minute, and the records did not agree on where he had started or what direction he had taken. That did not mean the city had lost control of the evidence. It meant the evidence had outrun the assumptions used to search it. The review team began mapping instances against street grids and camera cones, and the map quickly became difficult to trust. Some appearances pointed north, some south. Some showed him crossing open intersections in opposite directions without appearing on the connecting streets. One reviewer tried to reduce the problem by linking only feeds with the same clock source. That failed too. The synchronized cameras were the ones producing the most incompatible routes. A contractor report flagged the first hard contradiction. An instance at a riverfront stairwell was recorded, descending toward the water at the same minute. Another instance from the same man entered a dry service corridor 2 miles inland. There was no overlap in the route calculations. There was no shared visual bridge. Yet the frame-level timestamps, counters, and hash values all aligned. The report adds a line later reviewers underlined twice. The footage is internally consistent and externally impossible. The city then turned the problem into a table. Every confirmed appearance got a line: camera location, time, direction, head orientation, clothing condition, any audio, any environmental interaction. The table grew quickly enough that the reviewers began noticing patterns before they could explain them. The man did not simply repeat, he diverged. On one feed, he carried a paper bag. On another, his left sleeve was wet. On a third, he slowed at a storefront that reflected only part of his figure, as if checking whether someone stood behind him. He no longer behaved like a copy of a single event. He behaved like multiple events that had agreed on the same face. That observation came with a limit. Once the team started treating the appearances as instances, the old count became unstable. The number was revised upward twice in the same afternoon. It was never treated as final because search tools kept finding additional matches in feeds that had already returned nothing. One retail archive, reviewed after the fact, produced 18 new appearances from cameras the vendor had said were not recording that week. The vendor then produced maintenance logs showing the cameras had been recording locally after a failed firmware patch. That explanation helped the vendor and hurt the city. It made the problem broader without making it less real. There were also the first signs that the instances were not doing the same thing. A police supplement records a street camera at the edge of a courthouse plaza, showing the man standing still, while a second feed, 1 block away, showed him crossing the same district at a jog. A third camera caught him at a bus stop with his hands in his pockets, looking at the schedule board. Those positions do not align in any ordinary sequence. The city did not yet say impossible in the reports, but several staff members began writing adjacent instead. Adjacent became a substitute for explanation. The audio samples, limited as they were, made the pattern harder to ignore. The phrases had started to diverge in both content and quality. On one feed, the man seemed to say, "Not here." On another, later in the same minute, there was a softer phrase transcribed as, "Still here." A staircase camera caught a third phrase that sounded like, "Wrong way." The differences were subtle enough that no one trusted the transcripts immediately, but they were not random noise. The same voice, or one close enough to it, seemed to be answering different conditions in different places. An internal memo from the police evidence desk instructed staff to stop saying duplicate subject and to use repeat appearance instead. The memo was bureaucratic, almost absurdly so, but the wording was revealing. Duplicate subject would have suggested a copying problem. Repeat appearance suggested a phenomenon the department could record but not categorize. The memo followed a review room argument that the file does not fully preserve. What remains is one sentence from a technician's comment log. He wrote, "If these are all him, then which one is the original?" The route mapping then produced the strongest contradiction in the middle phase. Analysts traced 4 separate instances from different quadrants of the city toward the same transit exchange. The paths were independently plausible for each camera feed. None required a camera error. But the projected arrival times overlapped in ways that made physical sense only if the man could occupy all routes at once. One instance appeared on a platform camera, then on a stairwell camera 2 levels below, then on a street-level feed across the intersection, all within a span too short for any single body to cover the distance. The reviewers did not mark it as teleportation. They simply drew thicker lines over the routes and kept working. That was the point at which the city began to suspect the footage was organizing. The evidence did not yet show intent, but it showed convergence. Several instances were now moving through separate parts of the city toward the same district. The review packet for that district is dense and poorly sorted. It includes police body cameras, transit platform monitors, parking garage loops, and a private lobby system turned over under legal hold. The same face appears in all of them, but the posture is different in each. One man walks with his chin tucked. Another keeps his head raised. A third hesitates at reflective surfaces as if checking whether the lens is following him. A field note from a hardware inspection added a smaller but sharper detail. Technicians visited 3 camera locations that had produced unusually clear matches. None showed obvious tampering. The housings were sealed. The local recorders were intact. Yet each device had one thing in common. The timestamp display on the monitor feed was lagging by less than a second, a drift too small to matter for ordinary review and too consistent to ignore here. The note ends with the sentence later highlighted in orange. The system is not late, it is remembering late. By the end of the second review day, the most important fact was not the total count. It was that the count kept changing without changing the confidence of the records. The city could not dismiss the footage as corruption, because the camera angles, shadows, and motion blur still match their environments. It could not dismiss it as a coordinated intrusion, because the systems involved were too varied, and too many had been offline from the network at the time. It could not dismiss it as one person moving through the city, because several of the instances were being recorded in places that would have required the others to slow, turn, or wait in ways that never occurred on camera. Then the review room received a transit exchange export that had not been in the morning inventory. It was marked as recovered from backup media after a local recorder failure. The file showed the man standing on the platform edge, facing the lens, with the crowd around him moving normally. That was troubling enough. What changed the meaning of the export was the frame before he appeared. The platform was empty. The frame after he appeared was still empty except for him. No one had stepped into view. He was simply there. The metadata was valid. The camera had been recording. The city did not lose the record. It lost the comfort of ordering it. A second line in that export record was harder to absorb. The instance on the platform looked directly at the camera and spoke without raising his voice. The transcript only recovered 4 words. "I know where I am." The review notes do not say which instance said it. They only note that 2 nearby cameras captured his mouth, moving at different times, with different shapes to the sentence. After that, the city stopped talking about one man in any confident sense. It had too many authenticated appearances, too many route contradictions, and too many slight deviations to keep pretending the pattern was simple. The record suggested not duplication, but distribution under pressure. The next packet showed that the city had already begun finding him in places that were not supposed to exist yet. Recovered file 2047. Continuation from sealed municipal evidence transfer. This portion begins after the city had already accepted that the footage was genuine and still had not accepted what that meant. The decisive change came from archived material that was not part of the original audit. It had been pulled only because the route analysis failed to close. When the older exports were opened, the same unidentified man appeared on cameras tied to dates before the review began. The first confirmation was not dramatic. It was a maintenance corridor camera from the municipal library annex, a system the city believed had been replaced 2 years earlier. The export carried an older compression format and a valid chain of custody from a long, closed case. In the frame, the man crossed a tiled hallway carrying a paper cup. He was not looking at the lens. The timestamp placed him 3 days before the first citywide audit. The hardware logs attached to the file showed the camera had been disconnected for part of that week. The recorder still captured him. That single export changed the argument in the review room. Until then, the team had been treating the case as a simultaneous recording problem, something that might still belong to 1 minute, one network event, or one corrupted interval. The older file removed that restraint. The man now existed in evidence that preceded the investigation itself. A contractor note says the room went quiet for 11 seconds after the timestamp was verified. The city widened the search again. That produced the next rule of the anomaly. The man did not merely recur in archived footage. He recurred across archives closed under different retention schedules on systems no one had expected to hold usable video, and on cameras thought to have been dormant or physically absent at the time. One file from a demolition site showed him walking past a chain-link fence in daylight. The inspection report says the fence had not been erected until 4 days later. The image was authenticated anyway. The team tried to salvage a narrower explanation by focusing on site verification. They inspected installation records, replacement histories, and local storage logs. The result was worse than failure. A parking deck camera that should have been offline for repair produced a clear image of the man entering the stairwell. A police evidence camera from a temporary scene box, logged as unused, showed him crossing the background between 2 officers. A supermarket clip from the previous month showed him standing beside a display of bottled water while a cashier turned away. In each case, the appearance was technically coherent. Light fell correctly. Reflections matched. No frame damage suggested insertion. Some of these older appearances had been present in the archives before anyone knew to look for them. They were not added later as obvious artifacts. They had been sitting inside ordinary municipal storage, correctly indexed under unrelated incidents. Once the city knew his face, it began finding him everywhere in the backlog. That alone might have been chalked up to pattern bias, if not for the distribution of dates. He appeared in files from after the audit, before the audit, and in one case during a period when the city had no active network record at the site at all. The case notes become noticeably less certain here. One analyst wrote that the subject seemed to be moving toward intersections that were not yet open to traffic. Another noted that some older clips showed him looking directly into cameras mounted too high or too far away for him to have easily seen. That was not treated as a deliberate gaze at first. It became one when a body camera from a pedestrian stop was reviewed. The officer never addressed him. The man still turned his head as the officer raised the lens, as if he had heard the click of recording before the indicator light appeared. The transcript preserves only the officer saying, "Do you know this area?" The answer is lost under an audio gap. The next frame shows the man already walking away. By the third archive sweep, the city had enough material to define the next stage. The appearances were not evenly scattered, they were clustering. Not around a single address and not even around the transit exchange that had first complicated the route analysis. They were tightening around the older municipal core, the block where the city hall annex, the central station, and a pedestrian underpass overlapped in the maps. This did not immediately trigger evacuation because the city still had not assigned the case to any hazard category. Instead, it shifted the review to emergency coordination. That is where the documentation becomes more revealing and more unstable. Coordination logs show one operations supervisor asking whether the appearances could represent multiple individuals with the same face, moving independently through the system. A second supervisor rejected that. A third said the issue was no longer number. The log then records a brief interruption, followed by a phrase later repeated in more than one form. "He is not arriving. He is being found." The line appears in an internal note, a spoken summary, and a handwritten margin correction. The exact wording shifts, but the idea does not. The recordings from the core district introduced another rule. In several clips, the man was no longer merely passing through frame. He was pausing at points that should not have mattered. Outside a closed ticket office, beside a blank bus schedule panel, at the edge of an alley where no camera should have had a useful angle, he would stop and stand as if waiting for the lens to settle. He did not look theatrical. He looked occupied by something the footage could not show. On two feeds, reflections in glass behind him showed only partial movement, as if the camera had captured him before he finished turning. The reviewers did not agree on whether this was a compression problem or a behavioral change. They did agree that it began after the archive sweep. A private storage company added a consequence the city had not anticipated. Their lobby camera stored local footage on a disconnected recorder that was not supposed to share timestamps with the municipal grid. Yet, the same man appeared there at the same recorded minute as he appeared downtown. The analyst's annotation says, "Not imported. Native record." That removed the last easy boundary between public and private systems. The event was no longer traveling through one network. It was appearing wherever recording could preserve a moment. The speech fragments became clearer too, though not more reassuring. The transit exchange export had already carried a sentence. The older archive clips added different ones, each attached to a different camera and none consistent enough to be attributed to a simple loop. One stairwell microphone caught, I came back. A lobby camera recorded, not yet. A platform feed preserved, still here, but only after the final noise reduction pass. I am not treating them as proof of intent. I am treating them as evidence that the instances were no longer behaving like copies. They were behaving like related observations of something unsettled. The most difficult file in this phase came from a date the city had already closed. It was an old municipal archive export from the Transit Authority, labeled with a routine maintenance check. The subject appears for less than 2 seconds at the far end of a mezzanine. The image quality is poor, but the timestamp is clear. The date precedes the purchase of that camera model. The procurement record attached to the file confirms the unit had not yet been installed. The city audited the chain 3 times. Each time the file remained where it was. The camera that should not have existed recorded the man before anyone knew his name. That is where the review stopped being about scale and became about limits. The team could no longer say the records were all describing 1 minute, because some of the files came from before the minute in question. It could no longer say the records were all describing one man moving through the city, because the oldest clips showed him on routes that did not exist yet. It could no longer say the archives were contaminated, because the contamination was appearing inside records with no shared system, no shared storage, and no shared date. The final packet before the suspension order contains the closest thing this case has to a convergence report. It does not describe a spectacle. It lists cameras, dozens of them, then more. The instances had been tracked from separate districts toward the older core. Several were now on foot in recorded areas where the streets narrowed toward the station underpass. Others were standing still on unrelated feeds, facing lenses that had not yet been reviewed. The report notes, with visible strain, that the number of confirmed appearances increased after the city stopped actively searching. That is the last reliable pattern in the file. The final surviving visual record is a still sequence from the station approach. He is present in 3 adjacent feeds and absent from the 4th because that camera loses signal for 19 seconds. In the 2 feeds before the loss, the man is walking. In the 3rd, he has stopped. In all 3, he is facing the camera. The log does not preserve what happened after the signal returned. It only notes that several other cameras in the district went blank at the same time, while unrelated systems continued to record traffic normally. The city suspended the review after that. Not the cameras, the review. That distinction mattered. They sealed the core exports, reassigned the audit under a public safety hold, and restored ordinary operations in the affected districts within the week. No public notice was issued. Traffic coordination resumed. The transit board reopened the platform. Police access to the archive was narrowed to administrative staff only. What remains is narrow. A man appeared at the same recorded minute across a city. The appearances were independent, authenticated, and not identical. The city later found him in older footage, in dormant systems, and in archives that should not have held him at all. The transfer to Vault 13 includes an index entry for a body camera transcript that is missing from the package, and, separately, a transcript not listed anywhere in the manifest. I have checked the carton twice. Both errors survive the audit. One final administrative note closes the city packet. It states that all systems were confirmed operational after the incident review. That statement is probably true in the narrow sense. It is also the reason the file was sent to us. A second unopened transfer in the same municipal lot carries the same routing tag on 3 sleeves. I have not opened it. Recovered file, 2047, closing addendum. The sealed municipal transfer ended in a suspension order, but the closing documents show that the case was not finished. It was contained, renamed, and pushed back under routine administration. That matters because the final material confirms a rule the earlier sections only implied. Once the city stopped looking, the appearances did not stop. They shifted into the records that were not being watched. The first sign is a chain of custody discrepancy dated 3 days after the review was formally closed. A courier receipt lists the same evidence carton as moved from municipal archives to legal hold, then returned to archives, then sealed again under a different inventory number. All before the same business day ended. The signatures are genuine. The timestamps are not. One clerk note in the margin reads, "He was in the file room when we logged the box." No one there at the time could confirm who wrote it. That sentence would have been easy to dismiss if not for the appended media index. It belongs to a restricted duplicate set, one of the packages that arrived under the same city transfer tag, but was not listed in the manifest. It references 9 clips that do not appear elsewhere in the packet. Each comes from a different system, and each system is annotated as offline, decommissioned, or not yet installed. The pattern is unpleasantly simple. The longer the city delayed review, the farther back the man appeared to move through its archives. One of those clips is from a police evidence locker camera. The camera was pointed at shelving, not a person. The man appears only as a reflection in the locker door, standing behind the lens line. He is not in the room when the door is opened in the next frame. The reflection remains for one more frame after the door has swung wide. That is the only visual irregularity in the clip, but it changes the rest of the file. It suggests the appearances were no longer dependent on direct recording of his body. Any preserved surface became sufficient if the city trusted it enough to save it. The most damaging addition is a late report from the suspended review team. It notes that several of the confirmed instances had stopped walking before the station approach outage. That was already known. What was not known until this addendum is why the team stopped counting at that point. The report explains that the next review pass produced so many new matches that the analysts began encountering the man in footage already duplicated by their own search software. The file stopped being a search problem and became a comparison problem. The archive was finding him. A 2-second audio note is attached to that report, recovered from a hallway intercom test. A male voice, apparently calm, says, "Do not open the older bins. The source camera is absent from the inventory." The warning aligns with what happened next. 3 sealed evidence sleeves in the municipal lot were later found cut open from the inside. Their contents had not been removed. They had been refiled into adjacent sleeves with different dates. At that point, the municipality did what institutions do when a problem cannot be named without becoming larger. The review was closed in writing. The districts were declared stable. Public systems returned to normal. The transit board resumed service. The traffic office stopped issuing special routing notices. The police archive received a limited access flag that was not visible to general staff. The surviving facts are narrow. A man appeared at the same recorded minute across a city. The appearances were independent, authenticated, and not identical. The same man then began appearing in older footage, on systems thought to be offline, and inside records that should not have existed at the time. The transfer to Vault 13 still contains one indexed transcript that never arrived, and one unlisted transcript that did. I have checked the package twice. That contradiction remains. There is one other point worth logging before the file is closed. The same municipal routing tag that marked this case also appears on 2 unopened transfers in our own hold, both received with the same water damage and the same conflicting seal dates. I have not authorized their opening. I have not yet decided whether that restraint is procedural or advisable. The current file suggests those may no longer be different things. The case stays restricted. The city is quiet. The record is not. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.